right, we've got the best comebacks from my boy and your boy, Jordan B. Peterson. We're gonna dive right in this real quick, but first, please hit that subscribe button below, click like, and then we can get going on this thing. Do that right now, and I'll hit play. You ready? Let's do this.
Pronoun misuse may become actionable through the human rights tribunals and the courts, and the remedies: monetary damages, non-financial remedies, for example, ceasing the discriminatory practice or reinstatement to the job, and public interest remedies, for example, changing hiring practices or developing non-discriminatory policies and procedures. Jail time is not one of them. Jordan, you're not going to go to jail if you keep this up. Do you find that reassuring?
What if I don't pay the fine?
Then what?
Those are the sorts of problems that trans people face every day, being out of housing, being considered, considering suicide. These are really big problems.
My refusal to use pronouns because left-wing activists want me to use them has nothing to do with whether or not trans people are having difficulties in society. And I'd also like to point out that I've had many letters of support.
Isn't it?
I've had many letters of support from trans people, and they tell me that the trans activists don't support them, and most trans people
Jordan,
actually wanted to be referred to as he or she.
Doesn't mean
they
that
weren't
you
my
are
friends.
Untransphobic.
They
just
weren't
because
my
you
friends.
know a few people, just because you've talked to a few trans people, you don't know the trans community like the trans community does. You've got no idea what it's like to be trans.
Professor Pete, Professor Pete, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's let Professor Peterson finish his thought, please.
All right. So, the trans activists aren't proper representatives of the trans community because they haven't been elected by the trans community.
Nobody elected you, Jordan.
I'm not speaking for anyone except myself, and on behalf of other people, perhaps who want to maintain the right to free speech. I'm not claiming that I'm a representative of white people or white men or any other group. I'm speaking on behalf of myself, and so I'm not taking.
But Professor Peterson, let me jump in there, though, because we have seen an evolution of language. There are words that we don't use anymore.
Not by legislation.
Well, legislation or not, there are words that have evolved. We don't use, for example, I'm Asian. I would bristle if someone called me Oriental. That is an evolution of how we use words. How is this different, whether legislated or not?
I understand
I understand legislatively, but if at the heart of it is to allow a student to study free of what they feel is discrimination, why not help that along?
I already made my case for why not help that along. I believe that this legislation is extraordinarily dangerous, and there's other elements of it too that we haven't even got to in our society yet, like the protection for gender expression. And I've looked at gender expression in the Ontario Human Rights Code, and as far as I can tell, gender expression is best summarized in a single word: fashion.
Can someone please explain to Jordan B. Peterson that there's a difference between freedom of speech and freedom from consequence? Do you agree there's a difference?
Well, certainly there's a difference.
And are you prepared to suffer the consequences that society may deem you need to suffer because of your views?
Yes, I'm prepared to do that.
What does that entail?
Are you open to learning?
Well, hang on.
That's not the question.
Hang on, that wasn't the question. That's right.
Well, so what am I willing to do? Well, I think that the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal is probably obligated by their own tangled web to bring me in front of it.
So if you don't know, Jordan Peterson is from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. It's a province in Canada. And the provinces, I'm Canadian, so I know this, there's a Ontario Human Rights Council. So that's the provincial body that's in charge of handling human rights violations or reports against them. So I guess if someone was discriminated in a workplace, they could reach out to the Ontario Human Rights Council, if they're in Ontario, obviously, and it would be processed or managed through them, basically. So they're also in charge of putting out the policies for how they operate, and that's what Jordan Peterson is talking about here.
If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this. And that's that. I'm not using the words that other people require me to use, especially if they're made up by radical left-wing ideologues. Now, if our society comes to some sort of consensus over the next while about how we'll solve the pronoun problem, let's call it, and that becomes part of popular parlance, and it seems to solve the problem properly without sacrificing the distinction between singular and plural, and without requiring me to memorize an impossible list of an indefinite number of pronouns, then I would be willing to reconsider my position. But I'm also partly opposed to this because it's been made mandatory and has the whole weight of the law behind it. It's like, this is a very bad idea. I believe this is a very bad idea. And I believe that the reason this has caused so much noise, tremendous amount of noise, tremendous amount of attention on YouTube, is because there are things that are at stake in this discussion, despite its surface nature, that strike at the very heart of our civilization.
When people talk about common ground, it's got to be founded on some kind of truth. And when we have feminists saying, I don't believe in the biological differences between men and women.
Look at this t-shirt. Let's keep going.
Well, that's why it's controversial. Where do you go from there? That's why it's controversial to say what you're saying, and it's controversial to say, hold on a second, maybe a girl on testosterone therapy winning high school wrestling meets is a problem. That's controversial.
Yeah, maybe that's a bad idea. It's just possible that that's not a very good idea. You know, I mean, it's hard to imagine that that could be the case. But, well, in this idea that I don't believe in the biological differences between men and women, it's like, well, what do you mean by believe? Exactly. It's like you act out your belief. You know, I mean, what the hell does that mean? And what do you mean? See, what do you mean by belief? What do you mean by biology? And what do you mean by gender? Like, as soon as you put those three concepts together in a sentence that says, I don't believe in the biological difference between the genders, you throw the meaning of all three of those words up into the air so far that no one can tell what you're talking about, including you.
Yeah, and that's the goal, though, I think, a lot of the time. I think it's
Oh, definitely. The goal, part of the goal is an all-out assault on the categorical structure.
Do you think a trans woman is a real woman?
I don't really like the way those questions are formulated. You know, I don't know what that means. What do you mean a real woman?
Well, I'm asking you, in your mind, you know, it depends what you think a real woman is, but...
Yeah, that side of the chart, it's what he just said in the last video, or in the last clip. It's like, even the questions are phrased in a way that's like hard to answer clearly without, when the debate is going on about what's happening under the surface, when the debate is happening on the level of language, and you're just going ahead with your language when there's a disagreement about the language, you can't really have a discussion around the questions, right? Again, like what's being described as, I think it was Jonathan Pajot who said this, is that right now, the meaning crisis in Western society is around frames. It's not so much about the content of what we're saying, it's more about the frame, the questions you ask, the terms that you're using, how you treat language itself. So let's continue.
Do you think a trans woman is a woman?
No.
Why not?
Because I think that women are capable, generally speaking, of having babies, and they have female genitalia, and they have an XX chromosome, and I think the biological markers are relevant. It doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think that people should be treated with respect and dignity if they happen not to fit easily into a gender category. That's a different issue.
Right.
But it's a matter of definition, and I actually think it's a foolish argument in some sense, because what do you mean by real?
Well, I mean, you've just clarified that, though. You don't think that a trans woman is a woman. And do you think that that is what is behind or explains your opposition to this idea of a law mandating you to use a preferred pronoun, is because you don't actually believe that that's the truth, that a trans woman is a woman and therefore you can't use that pronoun?
No, that's not my argument at all.
Really?
Yeah, really. My argument is that the government shouldn't compel voluntary speech.
No, but I know what your argument is, and
no,
you've
but
made
that's
it very
really
clearly.
No, but that's exactly it.
But the motivation
behind it.
But you don't believe
I wouldn't
a trans woman is a woman.
put everything on my online in my life to take the stance I did unless I had thought that through very deeply. And I've thought it through very deeply. There aren't hidden motivations that have to do with some arbitrary prejudice against trans people.
See, that's really interesting. What he's saying there, like he said, you know, people have come after him proactively trying to like find any content that, you know, reveals secret alt-right tendencies or ethno-state beliefs or something like that. I've gone through his content. I just see a dude who's consistent as hell across time. Like his old book, Maps of Meaning, I think it was put out in like 1999 or the early 2000s. And it's based on material from the 2 decades prior to that. That was the first book I read from him. And it's actually like surprisingly like honest and straightforward and really interesting and really insightful and goes way deeper than these surface level interviews and like political questions. It's way more profound. So again, with these videos, what I'd like you to do is go check that stuff out. Look at maybe one of his Maps and Meanings lectures on his YouTube. See what's going on. He's not a guy with a hidden motivation. everything he says is precise because he says it consistent with who he is and what he believes. And that's been something over time. He's changed his beliefs over time, and he's talked about that actually, right? He's very honest in that sense too. So check it out.
Okay.
It's pure and simply this. There's never been a time in English common law history where the government compelled speech, and the Canadian government dared to do that. And that was unacceptable. And they masked it with this show of compassion for the oppressed, and I don't buy it. I mean, and I've spoken with no shortage of trans people, and you know, my proclivity has been, without exception so far, to address them in the manner that seems most socially appropriate under the circumstances. Now, you asked a specific question, which was, do I have special expertise that I might share with other people?
You're doing Martin Luther, and I think that these issues are a little subtler than those. And so,
well, what makes you think that you're doing the kids that are grandstanding any favors by going along with their manipulation?
Because I can't decide which ones those are. Well, I just have my gut instincts, and that's not good enough.
Look, fair enough, but you have a type 1 and type 2 error problem. So one error is that you don't call students what they deserve to be called. That's one error. And the other error is that you call students what they want to be called even though they don't deserve it. And so what you're trying to do optimally is to minimize both those errors. And to do that, you have to take a middle route. Now, what you've decided to do, and I'm not criticizing it, is you've decided to allow for the possibility 100% of one of those errors because you think it's a less significant error. And, you know, you might be right. But it's not like you're acting in an error-free manner. You've just decided to minimize one form of error at the expense of the other.
So I think what's going on here is he's speaking with, I guess, someone who must be a professor who has students and speaks to their students and treat their students like activists who can change the world, like people who can go out and change the world. But on one hand, that could allow perhaps, you know, and maybe this is definitely a minority, like narcissistic people or overconfident people or naive people. I don't want to use like very precise language. I don't want to use like harsh language there. I don't want to, because this is something I'm just like coming up with right now, but hear out this tentative idea that I'm going to share. So you can empower people like that because they could be the next, you know, Martin Luther is maybe what they were discussing about. Or you could shut them all down and be, you know, extra careful because maybe you'd let the, you know, the narcissist through and that could cause some trouble. So instead of trying to find the middle ground there, what he's suggesting is the professor decided, no, none of them are like the dangerous narcissistic types or whatever, however you'd characterize that side. And we're just going to assume that they're all, you know, good-willing, positive people who are only going to change the world for the better. And what he's saying is, well, it's not like, hey, like, how are you even going to navigate that? Fair enough. But you can't avoid the problem of managing those two errors. So let's continue.
Because I would say you're allowing, what would you call it, attention-seeking and somewhat narcissistic undergraduates to gain the upper hand over you in your class.
Well, it's not an essentially bad idea.
It's a terrible idea.
The tyranny of the patriarchy and the West.
It is an absolutely terrible idea when you assume that the fundamental reality of the West is patriarchal tyranny. It's like, compared to what exactly? Our societies are more free and more productive than any other societies in the world and than any other societies that have ever existed. Now, that doesn't mean they're without their faults.
No, but if you look and you say, look at the facts, and you look at who's in power...
And who is in power exactly? And what exactly do you mean by that? Let's say men.
Political power. Mainly men.
It depends on the domain. It's certainly not the case in anything that has to do with the provision of health. It's not the case in education.
No, but say political power.
At the very upper echelons.
Trump. Yes,
at the very upper echelons,
yeah.
Politics are dominated by men. What's the point? Does that make it a patriarchal tyranny?
Well, it certainly makes it patriarchal to a certain extent.
Well, and so when women participate in that patriarchal process, is that also a patriarchy? So when we have a healthcare system that's dominated by women, as we do now, is that a patriarchy?
No,
Why not?
I wouldn't call it a patriarchy.
Because it doesn't involve men.
Yeah.
Isn't it the structure that's patriarchal, or is it the gender that makes the difference?
Clearly you think it's the structure?
No, I don't buy the whole patriarchy idea or the tyranny idea. I think it's absolutely appalling. The idea that we have a hierarchical structure in the West is true. The idea that hierarchies tend towards corruption and deception and stultification across time is true. It's certainly the case that we need to be awake and criticize our institutions, but that is not the same thing as calling the West a patriarchal tyranny.
Right. So what's interesting is Jordan Peterson has studied the tyrannies and totalitarianism and authoritarianism of the 20th century to death. He's read everything in that area of literature, all the books on it, and speaks a lot about it. So he's very, very understanding of the fact that any structure, any hierarchy, any organization, big, small, homeowner associations, all the way up to countries and nations, they'll all have an element of tyranny to it. Because any system, to do anything, it requires some rules, right? It requires some structure. And that structure negates certain actions and certain ways of being. Like cultures are like that. It's like a culture is a certain way of being, and that negates certain other ways of being. Like tyranny, to some extent, is inherent to any kind of structural organization, right? The question is, how tyrannical is it? How corrupt is it? What we saw in the 20th century was like a massive influx of very rigid, very corrupt, highly tyrannical systems. It's always there to some extent because it's part of human nature, is what Jordan Peterson might argue, and I'd probably agree with that kind of thing. So when you try to say like, oh, something's tyrannical, we have to get rid of it, it's like, you're trying to get rid of an aspect of human nature that's inevitable. It's about finding the balance between structure, which provides, which staves off chaos and can be nurturing, versus when it becomes too tyrannical to the point where it's not nurturing anymore. Actually, it's like a horrible, it's a horrible 1984-esque situation, right? So the question, how do we deal with tyranny? Well, you can't get rid of it. It's a part of human nature. So I think Jordan Peterson might be highlighting that distinction here. Let's continue.
And words matter, especially among academics who should be very, very careful with their words and who aren't. We need a question.
Yes. Okay.
I mean, like I said, you're doing fine, but it's just too much. Like, I can't keep it straight.
Do you think that your behavior risks politicizing it, and do you think that politicization is justified?
I think my behavior risks politicizing it, yes. I would rather it not be politicized. And I'm doing what I can to manage that risk. However, it's become political in my country because the government implemented compelled speech legislation. So I wasn't complaining about that before it became political. Now, and there is a time, even when you're detached in some sense from the political realm, that you can't be detached anymore. Well, I'm not happy with the fact that this has become politicized. You could say that I haven't done a stellar job in ensuring in every possible manner that this has remained neutrally apolitical. Probably true, but I'm not particularly unhappy with the way things have gone so far. And I'm not happy with the radical left. And so if they're irritated at me, so much the better, as far as I'm concerned. So have I conducted myself perfectly? It's like, undoubtedly no. So I've got more than my fair share of faults, and a temper is one of them. But
right there, he says it, he admits it, right? His temper is something that he has to deal with, and that's an actual real fault of his. He said that numerous occasions, and I think in the Joe Rogan podcast, actually, he specifically said that after a really harsh interview, it takes him out for a week. He's just dead and negative and in a horrible space. Something like the GQ interview and the Channel 4 interview with Kathy Newman, those famous ones, he was not in a good mental place after that. He doesn't enjoy that. You see these videos and you think, oh wow, he destroyed some SJWs or whatever. I don't think that's part of his character. I think his place where he really thrives is in a classroom, working with people who are open-minded, or in a therapy setting, helping someone get their life together. That I feel like that's where he thrives more. And he's really touched by the struggles of others, and that really motivates him. He's more than willing to admit his own faults. So let's keep going.
I'm muddling through.
Why do you want to monetize?
Well, because I can do useful things with money. And partly because I'm curious, partly because I need to live.
So if you don't know, Jordan Peterson's made a lot of money previously on Patreon. I think before he was removed from it. I forget exactly what happened there. He also has an online personality course that he's offering online. And he also has the self-authoring program that is available on his website. on top of his books. And so she's asking, why does he monetize? Well, one thing about what he has to say about monetization is that, you know, if it's successful in a capitalist environment, there's something about it that has generated demand. So it's a metric of seeing whether or not it's useful enough if people would pay for it. And that's true. Because if you offer something for free, tons of people will get it. But no one's invested enough to actually act on it. Now, if you increase the price to 1 penny, you'll lose 90% of those people. But all the people that do buy it are actually going to do it and are actually going to be proactive and because they are invested in it to some extent. He's actually very generous in how he prices it. Like, it's not priced very high. And, you know, that's a relative thing, sure. But he also offers cool discounts and things. So, for example, in the self-authoring program, he has a 2-for-1 special where you pay the same price and then someone else can get it for free. What's that? It's a 2-for-1 if you just want to get a 2-for-1. Like, you know, you could, like, if you're just doing it for profit, that's a horrible idea. But obviously he's motivated by more than just that. Let's keep going.
Partly because my job was at risk for a long while, and that's not going to happen to me again. Partly because I had to give up my clinical practice because of other considerations. Partly because I have a family. Partly because I want to build an online university.
Is it about raising money for a cause, or is it about raising money for you?
Well, I don't separate myself from what I'm doing, so I can't really answer that question. I mean, for me, what, am I going to buy a yacht? No. You know, like, I'm not a luxury kind of guy. I'm not looking to live the high life. I'm 55 years old, for God's sake. What would I do with that? You know, I have lots of things that I would do with some money. One of the things I want to do is build an online university, but it's not the only thing I want to do. And so I would put the money to good use, I suspect, or at least to reasonable use. And the reason that people are providing me with this money, which they don't have to do, is because they hope that I'll continue to do what I'm doing. And that is exactly the reason they're providing it with me. And my leftist critics have been saying for consistently, it's actually quite comical. Well, look at all the money that Dr. Peterson is generating with his Patreon account. It's like, well, I'm not selling anything. All the stuff I do online is free. It's not even advertising supported. So if people want to support me on Patreon because they think that what I'm doing is helpful, then, like, more power to them as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you for watching, everyone. That was Jordan Peterson reaction. Make sure to click subscribe below, click that like button. Thank you all for watching. Check out Jordan Peterson's stuff. I'd love you to go see his original content. These interviews are just the surface level. It's much more interesting and much more profound when you get deep into his videos. So check that out, click subscribe and like. Thank you very much.